4T80 LS4 swap. What is the 4T80? The 4T80 is a very robust transaxle GM produced from 93 to 2011. These trannies can be found in anything that came equipped originally with a North Star motor that was front wheel drive. They're available with 3 different final drives. You can get a 311, 348, or 371, and those final drives were available from the beginning to the end of production in various models. Now, the transaxles are essentially broken into 2 different generations. You have 93 to 99, 2000 and newer. Now, externally, like physically, all the mounting dimensions, everything is identical between the 2. Internally, mechanically, everything is identical between the 2. It's the electronics that are different. So the easiest way to identify a first generation 4T80 is by the neutral safety switch or the range switch, which can be found underneath the shift lever. You'll notice this 2006 model has no range switch located there. And the reason being is that the range switch has been moved internally, which there's a couple extra wires in the pigtail of the harness that provide the same signals that that external unit provide. Now, the other major difference between these two is the manifold pressure switch and the lower valve body. The manifold pressure switch is actuated by the shift lever, and in the first generation, it's 3 position. The newer stuff is a 2 position. That's important. It's important for the electronic control of the transmission. I'm gonna go into more details about that later, but you know, essentially that's the only difference between the 2 generations. Everything else is the same. You can get the same gear ratios. All the internal components are the same. The major difference is the electronics. So now that we've discussed some of the differences between the generations of 4T80s, we're going to kind of talk about what it takes to bolt one up to an LS4. Unfortunately, it's not plug and play, and there are several areas that need to be clearanced or adjusted. So starting at the bell housing, the physical pattern between the North Star and the LS4 are almost identical with the exception of this lower area. This dowel doesn't get used, so it needs to be punched out of the block, and this ear that the engine stand's bolted to actually needs to be removed. So the dowel, you can actually just come from the backside and punch it out, and then this ear has a machine step that I've highlighted with a Sharpie. Typically what I do is I just come in here with a 4.5-inch cutoff disc, and then I come back with a flap disc and I profile it so that that arch is just nice and smooth. Now, the reason that ear needs to be removed is because it doesn't line up with anything on the back of the bell housing, and if you leave it, it actually contacts the tranny case. So if we take a look over here, get a better idea of what I'm talking about. If you had left that ear in place, it'd be resting on top of the transmission, and you would never be able to get the other bolt locations to line up. So that's the first step. The second step, on the back of the North Star, this is a dowel location. It's not a pass-through for a bolt, so this hole needs to be opened up. You can just come in here with a drill bit, open it up so that you can get an M10 into this location. So once those modifications have been done, you still use this dowel and you still use this dowel. So the transmission locates properly. And you're left with 4 bolts. 1, 2, the third one that you have to drill out, and 4. But that does leave the backside of the transmission unaddressed. Now, I've run it this way very successfully with only 4 bolts, but out of an abundance of caution, I developed this little clamp. Just an M10 thread through the center. It has a step that's located. You know, obviously the production ones are going to be aluminum. This is just 3D printed to show you. And what it does is it locates on that dowel that we had punched out of the back of the LS4 block, and it acts as a clamp. You can come through here and you can bolt it, and it just sandwiches the bell housing to the back of the block. Now, again, I've never had an issue, but it can't hurt, you know? So that addresses the alterations that need to be made to the bell housing. Now, there's also clearance issues on the block. The 4080 is just such a big transmission that the extension housing in the back of the case actually contact right above the number 3 main cap. So if you look here on the block, I've highlighted that area. Right above number 3, there's a bulge in the block. It's very thick casting. You're not gonna hurt anything by removing some material there. So again, I just come in here with a 4.5-inch flap and kind of smooth this out, bring it down. And if you're using a stock pan, like if you wanna modify your own, you're also gonna need to bring the rail down in that area. So what I try to do is I take as little material from the block as I can. I try to concentrate my grinding to the transmission case and this extension housing. So you kind of have like a part number here on the extension housing, and right below it is about the area of contact. So I just kind of try and smooth this. I work my way up and profile it so that it's right on top of those numbers. You do want to be careful. There's an O-ring underneath this case, and it sits inside of a groove. So if you go too far, you're going to hit the O-ring. So it probably wouldn't hurt for you to just unbolt this extension housing and take a look at it before you start grinding, just so you can kind of familiarize yourself with how much room you have to go. Because even once you grind down through the case and grind down through the engine block, it doesn't leave you with a ton of clearance. Let's see if I can get in here and kind of show you what I'm talking about. You know, you can probably get a couple business cards in between, you know, that extension housing in the back of the block. So that's the most critical area, and that's probably the most time consuming to get that to fit properly, but it's essential. You know, you can't have the transmission resting against the engine block. You'll have all sorts of alignment issues. You won't be able to bolt the assembly together. So, you know, you really have to take a lot of time and concentrate on that. Now, another area on the transmission that'll need to be addressed is this casting. There's a stand here. You can see I just drew a straight line across, and it protrudes up through here. I cut all of that off. Come through here with a 4.5-inch cutoff wheel again, whack that ear off straight down through the casting. Same thing, come up through here, and I profile it back in. Now, neither one of those pieces serve, you know, these extensions, these little casting ears, they serve absolutely zero purpose. None of that gets bolted to anything on an LS4. They just, you know, it's just casting. And if you leave those, it's gonna contact the oil pan. Whether you try and run an OEM pan or an aftermarket pan, it doesn't matter. These are gonna interfere. So you have to remove those two areas as well. And again, I can kind of show you on this assembly what it looks like when it's all cut down and smoothed out. You can see, and it almost looks factory. I just come in there with the cutoff wheel, hit it with the flap disc, smooth it all out, make it look nice. While we're on that topic, one more area that may or may not interfere, depending on what pan you run, are these two ears. Where the transmission pan bolt out. You can see the actual steel pan protrudes past the casting. At a minimum, you'll need to remove that little area, that little lip that protrudes, and you might need to smooth down the casting a little bit too. I found that's an issue with stock pans. With sheet metal pans, there's a lot more clearance there, and typically I don't have to touch that area. All right, so we've modified our engine, we've modified the tranny case. We're ready to bolt the two together, but first we need to address the torque converter. This is a factory 4T80 torque converter. The spacing is correct for the LS4 flex plate. The pilot's correct for the back of the crank. You don't need to make any modifications to the converter itself. In theory, you could take this setup and you could drop it right in, you could go. It would be a little tight for most applications, but if you're like a cam only deal or, you know, lower horsepower, stock converter will be fine. If you want to go with an aftermarket converter, right now the only company I'm aware of that makes like a billet lockup would be Precision Industries. But I am working with another manufacturer to come out with a more race-oriented unit that would support, you know, really high horsepower. But out of the box, you know, essentially you're stuck with this, a unit from Precision, or reinstalling a stock converter and just changing the stator. Now, while you don't need to make any modifications to the 4T80 converter, you do need to modify the LS4 flex plate. The 4T65 uses a 3-bolt pattern on the converter, where the 4T80 obviously uses 4 mounting pads. So any competent machine shop can take your stock flex plate, index this pattern, and drill it on here. There's plenty of material. I've done it multiple times and it works fine. Your only other option would be to consult a company like Mizir and have them do a one-off flex plate. Obviously that gets pretty expensive. You know, I might offer something down the road. Right now, I don't have any plans to. I have re-drilled plenty of these for customers. But, you know, that covers things you need to take into account with the converter. So everything we've discussed up till this point has been pretty universal about getting the 4T80 to bolt up to the LS4. Now we're going to highlight some things to watch out for when you're swapping this into a W body, especially if you're using my mounts, just kind of a tutorial of how to get this all together and up and in the car. So first thing is, my 3-piece mounts are designed to work with a production LS4 subframe. Impala SS, Monte Carlo SS, Grand Prix GXP, Buick LaCrosse Super, originally equipped with a 5.3, it's got to be that subframe. If you have a 6-cylinder aluminum subframe, my mounts aren't going to work. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Now, my mounts are solid and they're 3-piece. You've got 1 on the motor and 2 on the transaxle. Now, my mounts eliminate the need for the dog bone. You know, the dog bone is that mount that traditionally comes off the cylinder head and goes to the upper radiator support. So it's just 3 solid mounts triangulated, eliminates the dog bone. And when you go to set them in, because they are solid, you need to loosely install them on the motor and transaxle first, set them down in the subframe, put your hardware up from underneath, get it all squared, and then tighten it down. Don't try to tighten one mount, you know, don't try to tighten the mount solid on the motor. Nothing will ever line up. So one thing to keep in mind, my mounts move the engine and transmission forward on the subframe roughly about 1 inch. And the reason for that is because the transmission's so large, we run into clearance issues at the steering rack. So I've designed these mounts to still be very, very close, so it moves it forward a minimal amount. But before you go to install the motor and transmission on the subframe, you're gonna wanna flop your rack bolts around. So from the factory, the rack bolts come in from the back, there's a nut, and all the extra length of the bolt protrudes towards the front of the car. So you're gonna wanna flip those around, and in some cases, you might even need to shave down the head of the bolt a little bit. It's a very, very tight fit, as you can see. Now, the reason that I made that fitment so tight is because naturally, the further you move this drive line forward, the closer you get to the radiator. Now, if you have a big aftermarket radiator, you know, you got some SPAL fans or something, you're gonna run into clearance issues with your exhaust if you keep cranking this thing forward. So I tried to keep it as neutral as possible. That's just how the mounts are designed. Now, once you get it all bolted up on the subframe, you go to put it up in the car, you've checked all your clearances. One other thing you should really take into account is your shifter. I do not recommend running a factory 4T65 shifter. The detents are different spacing than a 4T80 shifter. I've actually measured like a Cadillac shifter in comparison to one out of my Monte Carlo. And what I found works the best is a ratchet or gate style shifter. So this is my billet arm that we designed for the B&M Pro ratchet. I really like that shifter on these cars, and it gives you positive engagement in between each gear. So, you know, stay away from the stock shifter at a minimum. You know, if you're on a budget and you want to run a stock style shifter, try to snag one from like a Cadillac and adapt it to work for your application. But stay away from the 4T65 one, because again, the detents are in a different position. You don't want this thing getting hung up in between gears and burning up a tranny because it's bleeding off pressure internally. Speaking of burning transmissions up, the cooler lines are another thing that need to be considered. So On the 4T65, the two cooler fittings are located low on the driver's side, right in the front of the transmission. On the 4T80s, they're staggered. You have one in the front, which is just a regular -6 JIC thread with an O-ring. So that's really easy. You can either run a -6 cooler line, or you could do a male -6 to -8 adapter. And then your other cooler fitting is in the back of the transmission. So at least one of your cooler lines is going to need to be extended. Now in the rear, the cooler fitting has an extension tube, very much like the 4L80s. You need to be conscious of that when you're putting fittings back here. You don't want to put one without the extension fitting. So I think there's a couple companies that offer them, like Russell. I'll put a link with the part number to the fitting you should be looking at in the description of the video. But when you get it, just compare the length of the extension tube. I believe the 4L80 is a little bit longer, so that tube will just need to be cut down a little bit if you want to switch from a push connect style to an AN fitting for your hoses. We're going to go ahead and wrap things up. We covered all the mechanical aspects of what it takes to get that transmission bolted up to your LS4. Next week, I'm going to shoot a video on the electronic portion of the swap and a couple different options you have using OEM type computers, even some standalone stuff, and I'll go into detail on how you can convert that Generation 1 4T80 to full manual. I hope you found this video useful. We covered a lot of stuff in a really short period of time, so I'm sure I missed some things. If you have any additional questions or concerns, drop them in the comments. I'll see what I can do to help you out. Thank you for watching.